Being a woman in the past meant having little freedom and constant hardship. Daily life was physically and socially demanding. For most of human history, there was no modern police force, no forensic lab, and no single set of rights that protected every person in the same way. Communities still had rules, courts, and punishments, but the system worked very differently. In many places, a woman's position in that system depended on her family role: daughter, wife, widow, servant, enslaved person, or member of a religious community. Her daily burdens were often heavy, and her legal voice was often limited. This documentary-style explanation looks at how older systems of crime, justice, investigation, and punishment worked, and why those systems placed special pressures on women. The goal is not to tell dramatic stories, but to understand the structure, who had authority, how wrongdoing was reported, how evidence was gathered, what courts could do, and what kinds of penalties were common. Start with the basic problem. If there is no professional police force, who responds to crime? In many pre-modern societies, the first responsibility fell on households and neighbors. If someone stole property, assaulted a person, or damaged a home, the victim and the victim's family usually had to raise the alarm, identify suspects, find witnesses, and push the case forward. Local officials existed in many regions, but they were often part-time, unpaid, or focused on keeping order rather than investigating past crimes. This matters for women because daily life often kept women closer to the household and the neighborhood, while men more often held formal roles in local authority. So women were frequently close to the events and the consequences, but not equally positioned to steer the legal process. In parts of medieval and early modern Europe, community-based systems expected ordinary people to assist when wrongdoing happened. The idea was simple: the community had a duty to keep the peace. If a crime was seen, bystanders were expected to raise an alarm so neighbors could help pursue the suspect. These systems could work quickly for crimes witnessed in public, but they worked poorly for crimes that happened in private spaces, such as inside homes or out of view. That difference affected women in two directions. First, many harms women faced were more likely to happen in private. Second, when the legal system depended on public pursuit and public witnesses, private harm was harder to prove. Now consider another key issue: legal identity. In many historical legal traditions, adult men were treated as the basic legal actors in public life. Women could have legal standing in some settings, but it was often filtered through male authority. In Roman law, for example, there were forms of guardianship that applied to women in certain situations, especially when they were legally independent from a father or husband. The stated purpose was protection and management of property matters, but the effect was that a woman's ability to make certain legal transactions could depend on a guardian's approval. That could shape everyday reality: managing money, receiving inheritances, making contracts, and deciding what to do when disputes arose. In English common law, a famous doctrine later described as coverture treated a married woman's legal existence as merged with her husband's in many respects. This did not mean all married women had no rights in all circumstances, but it did mean marriage often reduced a woman's ability to own property in her own name, sign contracts freely, or bring certain kinds of legal actions without her husband. Even when local custom or special legal arrangements gave some women more control, the default structure placed married women at a disadvantage in disputes involving property, debts, and workplace conflicts. These limits mattered for crime and justice in practical ways. Think about theft, wages, or debt. If a woman's property was legally managed by a husband or a guardian, then the official victim in a legal complaint could be the man, not the woman, even when she did the labor that produced the property or depended on it for survival. If a dispute was framed in court as a conflict between men, a woman's experiences could be treated as secondary evidence rather than the main issue. Another major factor was the household itself. In many places, the household was not just a family unit, it was an economic unit and a discipline unit. Work, apprenticeship, service, and shelter were all tied together. The head of the household, often a man, had formal and informal powers over dependents, including wives, children, servants, and apprentices. This could create stability, but it also created risk. If harm occurred inside the household, the same structure that provided food and safety could also limit the ability of a woman or girl to seek outside help. Pre-modern courts did exist, but the path into court could be difficult. Many systems relied on private complaints rather than automatic public prosecution. That meant someone had to spend time and money to file a case, travel to hearings, and bring witnesses. For a woman with heavy domestic labor, childcare responsibilities, and limited independent income, this barrier alone could block access to justice. Even when the law allowed women to testify or complain, practical limits, money, mobility, social pressure, fear of retaliation often shaped what happened. When disputes reached a court, the next question was evidence. Before modern forensics, proof depended heavily on eyewitness testimony, reputation, sworn statements, and physical signs that ordinary people could recognize. In some places and times, written records became more important, but literacy and access to paperwork were uneven. Women's testimony was treated differently across societies. In some legal traditions, women could testify but were sometimes seen as less authoritative. In others, women's testimony was restricted in specific kinds of cases. Even where formal rules did not exclude women, social expectations could influence how seriously their words were taken. For women, the legal system's focus on reputation could be especially dangerous. In tight communities, reputation served as a kind of evidence. But women's reputations were often judged through moral standards about sexuality, obedience, and household behavior. A woman described as disorderly, promiscuous, or argumentative might find her statements doubted more easily than a woman described as modest and quiet. This was not just a cultural issue. It became a legal issue when reputation influenced whether officials believed a complaint, whether neighbors agreed to testify, and whether a court imposed a harsh penalty. The economic side of justice is also crucial. Courts collected fees. Officials expected payments. Fines were common punishments and also a source of revenue. If a system punishes wrongdoing mainly through fines, then poverty becomes a legal hazard. A poor woman could face harsher outcomes, not because her offense was worse, but because she could not pay. If she lacked a male supporter with resources, the problem could be worse. Punishment in older systems had a wide range. Many communities used fines, restitution, public shaming, short imprisonment, banishment, corporal punishment, and in serious cases, execution. Punishments were often public. Public penalties were meant to warn others and restore order, but public punishment also reinforced social hierarchies. A person with high status could sometimes negotiate penalties, use networks to gain mercy, or shift blame. A woman with low status, limited family protection, or a controversial reputation might have fewer defenses. It also matters that older systems were not only about crime in the modern sense. They were also about controlling behavior that threatened social order, sexual conduct, marriage rules, childbirth outside marriage, and conflicts inside families. For women, these were not side issues. They were central. In many societies, rules around marriage and reproduction were enforced through church courts, local courts, or community discipline. A woman could be punished or shamed, not only for acts that harmed others, but for behavior seen as upsetting moral order. This leads to one of the most famous examples of how law, investigation, and punishment worked without modern policing: witchcraft prosecutions in parts of Europe and colonial North America. These cases show how a legal system can treat suspicion and rumor as actionable when authorities believe a hidden crime exists. Witchcraft prosecutions varied widely by region and time. In some places, special procedures were used. and in some places torture was permitted or expanded under certain rules. Accusations often began locally, among neighbors, and then moved into formal courts. Women were frequently accused, though men were accused too. The legal process often depended on confession, witness statements about strange events, and interpretations of misfortune. From a systems view, witch trials show several pressures that could fall heavily on women. First, the crimes were often defined in a way that connected to everyday domestic life, illness, childbirth problems, food spoilage, animal deaths, and conflicts between neighbors. Second, the evidence was often indirect because the supposed act was secret. Third, the community's social tensions, poverty, dependency, disputes over charity, arguments between households could become legal accusations. In a world with limited medical knowledge and frequent hardship, it was easy for ordinary misfortune to be interpreted as intentional harm. But it is important to be careful here. Witchcraft prosecutions were not the normal, everyday experience for most women in most places. They are better understood as one kind of crisis that could emerge when courts, theology, local conflict, and fear combined. The larger point is how an investigative system without forensics can rely on community belief, and how that reliance can amplify bias. Another area where women's burdens were shaped by justice systems was sexual violence and coercion. Across many historical periods, laws existed against rape or forced sex, but the way those laws worked often made convictions difficult. Systems that required multiple witnesses, immediate public outcry, or proof of physical resistance could fail to capture the reality of private attacks, threats, or coercion. If the victim's social position was low, or if the accused had status, the imbalance could shape outcomes. Also, in some societies, certain harms were framed as offenses against a male guardian's honor or property interests, rather than as violence against the woman as an independent person. That framing affected what remedies were available and what the court considered important. Even when women were not victims, they could become entangled in justice systems through survival strategies. Poverty, lack of access to land or skilled trades, and dependence on service work could push women into risky informal economies. In many times and places, women had fewer lawful paths to independent income. When authorities cracked down on begging, unlicensed selling, or certain forms of work, women could be targeted because they were visible in public spaces trying to support children or elderly relatives. Again, this is not about dramatic individual cases. It is about the structure of opportunity and enforcement. We should also look at the special position of widows. Widowhood could bring both vulnerability and legal power, depending on the region and the era. In some systems, widows could control property or manage a household business in ways married women could not. In other systems, widows faced pressure from male relatives, creditors, or officials. Their ability to defend rights could depend on documents, witnesses, and the willingness of courts to recognize their claims. Across many societies, the line between civil disputes and criminal cases was thinner than it is today. A conflict over wages, a broken promise of marriage, a debt, or a disputed inheritance could threaten survival. If someone's survival is threatened, the pressure to use courts, community leaders, or informal retaliation grows. Women could be caught in these conflicts because they were central to household labor and family care, yet often lacked full control over property and formal authority. Finally, remember that before modern law enforcement does not mean without law. It means law was enforced through different tools: community obligation, household authority, religious courts, local magistrates, and social reputation. Investigation was often done by victims and neighbors, not by trained professionals. Punishment often aimed at public order and community warnings, not rehabilitation. Rights were not evenly distributed, they depended on status, gender, marital position, and class. When we put these parts together, the daily challenges women faced become clearer without needing dramatic scenes. Women carried heavy responsibilities inside households and communities. At the same time, legal systems often treated them as dependents, limited their control over property and contracts, and judged their credibility through moral standards. In systems that relied on community reporting and reputation, that combination could make women both highly visible as subjects of regulation and less powerful as agents in their own defense. Understanding these older systems helps explain why changes in legal identity, property rights, and professional investigation mattered so much later on. When a society shifts from community pursuit to professional policing, from household authority to individual rights, and from reputation-based proof to evidence-based investigation, the daily balance of power changes. For women, those changes were not only about formal equality on paper. They were about who could speak, who could move, who could own, and who could realistically ask the system for protection.